Welcome, friends, this evening for a conversation with Reverend Matthew Laferty, a Methodist at the Vatican, the Work of Ecumenical Ministry at the Holy See. This is part of a conversation that is ongoing this weekend in a transformational leadership class entitled Leadership in Ecumenical Life. So we're glad that you're joining us for this part of that conversation. Reverend Matthew Laferty is a YDS alum from 2011, a pastor, an ecumenist, a missionary based in Rome, where he serves as the director of the Methodist Ecumenical Office in Rome. He's responsible for the World Methodist Council's relationship with the Holy See, with the Vatican. He's also the co-secretary of the Methodist-Roman Catholic International Commission, the official theological dialogue commission between the World Methodist Council and the Holy See. Matthew served for nearly a decade in migrant and multicultural ministries in Europe, first in Moscow, Russia, and later in Vienna, Austria. He had good years at Yale Divinity School. When he was here, he worked at the Tabor Lutheran Church in Branford as an intern, and also with the Connecticut AIDS Resource Coalition, now AIDS Connecticut. He has completed a Master of Law in Canon Law at Cardiff University in the United Kingdom. But he's really from Crestline, Ohio. He's served the Methodist Church in a whole range of ways, including as a delegate to the National Conference of the United Methodist Church in 2004 and 2008, 2020, and 2024. Welcome, Matthew. We're so glad that you're with us. And joining you in conversation is Professor Mark Heim. Professor Heim is the Samuel Abbott Professor of Christian Theology at Andover Newton Seminary at Yale Divinity School, a graduate of Amherst and Andover Newton Theological School and Boston College. His teaching and research interests include comparative theology, theologies of religious pluralism, science and theology, Christology and atonement, and ecumenical ecclesiology. He's widely published and a beloved faculty member here at YDS. He and Matthew had a chance to get to know each other when Professor Heim and Melissa Heim were at the Vatican, and he's an ideal partner in conversation tonight. Welcome to you both.
So I think we're live.
Yes.
So we've already begun a conversation with Reverend Laferty in the class, so we're going to be revisiting something we've already talked with you. But so in a moment, I'm going to ask you this job, Methodist representative of the Methodist Communion to the Vatican. What is that job? But my first question to you is, how did you come to have this job? What's the path that led you from Yale Divinity School in 2011 through some stops in Russia and in Austria to Rome and to be in this ministry?
It's not a straight line. I didn't come to YDS with a grand vision that one day I would be working in the Methodist Ecumenical Office in Rome representing the worldwide Methodist family. When I came to YDS, I was a reluctant student. I was reluctant because I didn't want to go to seminary. That was never my plan. I'd done an undergraduate degree in political science and international affairs, and was very much interested in foreign affairs. I wanted to go in the foreign service, be a diplomat. And God called me to do something that I wasn't quite prepared to do, but it clearly was going to seminary. So I ended up at YDS, and then asked for a mission assignment. I was a little bit concerned about where I go. There's some Methodists who are here. I was saying earlier to the class, Methodists are provincial in a sense because we never really leave the place where we've been ordained. So I wasn't sure. I wanted to go back to Northeast Ohio. And they said, we have a mission assignment if you're interested in going to Moscow, which I was asking to go to Russia. So they said, please come. But what was clear, what's been consistent throughout my life and ministry is work, cooperation, unity with other Christians has always been foundational. That's growing up in the Methodist congregation I did in Ohio, which was very engaged in the little community I grew up in, ecumenically. Everything was always ecumenical. Our vacation Bible school was ecumenical. It was really important to do things in Lent together, which my parents who are here tonight, they insisted that we go to. So it was quite natural to think and act with other Christians. That's part of how I ended up at YDS. I wanted to be in a place where that was built in a very intentional way. And the work that I was doing in Russia, I was working in a United Methodist, Evangelical Lutheran, American Baptist, Presbyterian Church USA, Reformed Church and America ministry. The 5 churches shared this ministry. So again, it was baked in, and it made sense in my mind. It didn't make sense in a lot of other people's minds because they wouldn't normally see maybe this configuration of churches. I was working with migrants and refugees, and so in 2015, then when my term was about to expire, the United Methodist Church asked if I would go to Austria. And what was important there was I was also asked to work on behalf of the United Methodist Church at the United Nations in Vienna, doing representational work in our UN ministry. And so then that gave me an experience of what it meant to represent Christians and to another body of people. This happened to be an international organization. And so that gave me some then foundation. So when they were looking for somebody, they called and said, would you apply? And I did, expecting not to be called back. But it was clear that my experience in ecumenism, my experience and knowledge of Methodists worldwide, and my experience doing representational work were all important features of that.
Well, for those of us who can't quite imagine what it means to be doing the job that you're doing, what is that like? What does a Methodist representative to the Vatican get up in the morning and do during the day?
No day is the same. I think that it's quite dynamic, is the best way to describe it. So there are several areas of work that we have. So to speak about it in broad terms, part of our work is purely representational. How does my office be the presence of Methodist churches in Rome and speak into different spaces? So that could be conferences, that could be events we're putting on ourselves. How do we share what's important about Methodist on climate change, for example, on Christian unity, on a whole range of subjects? Part of that then is also about dialogue. So our office staffs an official dialogue between the Vatican or the Holy See and the World Methodist Council. The World Methodist Council is the international association of Methodist churches. We're 80 member churches worldwide with about 80 million baptized members. And so collectively, we do ecumenical relationships and interreligious relationships together and a number of other areas. And so from 1967, we have had a bilateral or a two-party dialogue with the Vatican and Methodist. And there's a lot of work that happens there. So we bring together scholars who have a focused area where we have dialogues. We talk about what do Methodists say about, right now we're working on diversity and unity. So when we talk about diversity, what does diversity mean? How is it represented in our traditions? Where are the frontiers or the boundaries of diversity? What's acceptable diversity is one of the questions we're trying to explore. Or as it's often been described earlier as legitimate diversity. What is it? How can we say we're united and then also embrace the gift of diversity that God has given us? Where are the boundaries and limits of that? So that's one pillar. We just had our meeting 3 weeks ago in El Salvador. So there's a lot of preparation. My office is responsible for making sure everybody does their work. We get it prepared. Now we're in revision. We accompany groups who come, so pilgrim groups. In the pontificate of Pope Francis, he very much liked meeting people. So we said to our bishops, come to Rome and meet Pope Francis, and they did. And he met all of them. And so particularly in the last 2 years of Pope Francis' life, there were many, many encounters between senior Methodist church leaders. And sometimes we would have pilgrim groups from from a Methodist seminary come, and he would come and greet them personally. Part of that work of encounter is trying to destigmatize one another. That it's hard for us to think about how we might seek the unity of the church if we are unknown to one another. And unknown can be just simply because we've not met. It could be stigma, it could be a number of things. So accompanying particularly senior church leaders in that experience to help lay a better foundation for when they return home, to say, maybe I can call the local Catholic bishop who I maybe never talked to or met before, and see how we at least can start an informal conversation relationship with one another. And then the other part is trying to do educational work. So we host events, talk about what Methodists are doing. We're planning a webinar in the late winter talking about what Methodists think of the Bishop of Rome, the so-called Petrine ministry. So as you know, Peter was the first bishop, if we can say that, in Rome, and plays an important part in the mythology, is probably the best way, the theology of the Pope and the office of the Bishop of Rome. And so the Catholic Church has asked all the churches to reflect on, is there a role of the Bishop of Rome for other churches, and what does it mean? So we're trying to explore some of that and trying to educate Methodists and do some work within our own communion among Methodist churches about issues that are important ecumenically.
So you certainly could say that the large headline over the job, the kind of work that you do, is ecumenical relations. And I wonder if you could say a word about, we have a generational difference here. I can think about the ecumenical movement in the 60s and 70s. When I got involved in it, there was a certain kind of energy around it and certain kinds of questions that were sort of burning on people's minds. But the question I'd put to you is, so now, why would students at YDS, or why should people at YDS be interested in ecumenical relations as a topic of interest and concern on the list of things that we should be interested and concerned about? Because I would say, frankly, I don't see it as being an early number on that list for many people today.
Mm-hmm. There are many ways one can answer. I think the one that's automatic is that it's God's will for the church to be one. We need to spend a lot of time, more time than we have tonight, to talk about what does unity mean, what does oneness mean of the church. But this is God's will for God's church. So that's probably the most important thing. That's where I would start. But I would also reflect in an American religious context. Students at YDS, whether they go into parish ministry or whether they find their calling in other places, are not going to be alone. You can't be the pastor of the Methodist Church downtown and without relationships with your neighbors. And New Haven, Crestline, Ohio, where I grew up, one way to think about it is what is the witness of the churches together for issues that are impacting the places where we live. So that's one way people come into ecumenism. It's not through an academic, heady way. It's about saying, this is an evil happening in our community, and you're angry, and I'm angry about it, and what are we going to do with that holy anger to create positive change in the places where we're living? And people who might understand that the best are other Christians, maybe not of my church, but there might be the ones across the street and down the road and around the corner. And I think one of the radical witnesses of the church in our current political climate in the U.S. is to try to hold a space where people can encounter one another with different perspectives and not feed into a polarization. And for me, this is very much the ministry of Jesus, going and encountering others who didn't share his opinion, who rejected him. And so it's part of the witness of the church then.
So when we think about the visible unity of the church, in the ecumenical movement, people often thought about historical divisions, ones going back a long way, ones between Orthodox and Catholics, between Protestants and Catholics from the Reformation, different Protestant groups among each other, and so on, and more recent causes of division. And I think it would be fair to say that, though maybe today many people aren't aware of the history, that there has been a lot of progress made in terms of full communion between many Christian groups that wouldn't have shared communion together, wouldn't have recognized each other's ministries, wouldn't have accepted each other's membership, and so on. Now it's sort of a new ground zero that people recognize. So my question is, what do you think are those things have not been, the historical ones have not been completely resolved by any means. Office of the Papacy is an example, but what do you think are the newer causes of division that you find being addressed and being raised in your world as of most concern?
So one of the emerging areas where there's this conversation about what are the issues that are dividing us in ways that haven't in the past is around moral and ethical questions, as they're often described. The World Council of Churches has done a whole series in the last 10 years on moral discernment, asking churches, how do you discern moral issues? As a way of trying to initiate dialogue among the member churches of the World Council of Churches to think about those questions as the foundation of some dialogue. How do we better understand? What are sources of authority? What are methodologies? How are questions discerned? And so those questions around moral discernment are some of the obvious things. Divorce. For some Christians, a divorce as a issue for the church to discern is new. For others, it's not. But divorce is one of the issues. Human sexuality. And actually a broader question about human anthropology. What does it mean to be human? And what does that mean for one's gender identity and sexual orientation? So that's continues to be an emerging issue. Questions related to what Catholics would often talk about as life. So those could be abortion, capital punishment, war, nuclear weapons. And so it's interesting because it's often questions that impact us in the Christian life. And I think that's what's maybe more unique than some of the questions of the Reformation that are still, we talk about places where we don't agree as areas we still need deepening. Because we believe in a very eschatological way that all these divisions will be healed in the fullness of time. So we just need more deepening of an understanding and journey accompaniment with one another. But some of those questions are important theological questions that maybe are kind of related to the life we want to live as Christians because they're sacramental or liturgical or questions of ecclesiology. But the moral ethical questions are often about how we live in the world and the church's witness of the life in the world. The Anglican Roman Catholic Commission is working on moral discernment as well and thinking about it in a frame of receptive ecumenism. So this understanding that we, as churches, we give gifts to one another through dialogue. So what can I share to help you understand how you think about the question as well? And what can you share with us to help us understand in a fuller way how we're thinking about moral ethical questions?
So these kind of bilateral discussions, Methodist, Roman Catholic, Anglican, so on, that's one of the vehicles which this process moves forward. The World Council of Churches, the National Council of Churches, councils of churches in many parts of the world were vehicles of the ecumenical movement for a good time and remain that. But they're also, part of the ecumenical problem is that there are also churches and communions that were either not part of those movements or that didn't exist at the time of the historical divisions. in Christianity. So they come at this with a different perspective. So my question is about vehicles for ecumenism. Obviously, when the Roman Catholic Church decided after Vatican II to become part of this discussion, that was world-changing. I mean, and the situation that you're involved in is created by that situation. So of course, the World Council of Churches continues, the local national councils of churches continue, but are there other emerging vehicles or avenues for this kind of discussion? I know you've been involved in the Global Christian Forum, and that's quite an unusual thing I think most people are not really aware of.
So when you look at an international level, there are many ways that we're seeking unity. So both bilateral, so church to church, and multilateral. So it's churches with other churches together, World Council of Churches being one of them. What's interesting is the World Council of Churches doesn't include the Roman Catholic Church, for example, in their general membership. Now, the Catholic Church cooperates very closely and is full members of different organs of the World Council of Churches, but it is not a member church. Part of that is because of the goal that the World Council of Churches sets for full visible unity. And it's not that Catholics do not want that, but the terms in which they feel they can accept that is not in alignment with those goals. And so as part of that, they've not participated fully in the World Council of Churches. But your point then, looking at then other vehicles, how do Christians encounter one another? And the Global Christian Forum is not an organization, it's a platform. The World Council of Churches several years ago, and I think their assembly in Harare in the 80s, said, we recognize there are a lot of churches who will never join our fellowship. The World Council of Churches represents maybe 500 million Christians. The Roman Catholic Church is 1.4 billion by Vatican statistics. Pentecostal and evangelical churches is as equal or larger than the Catholic Church by their own numbers. So then you say, wait a minute, 3/4, 5, 7, 8, whatever the fraction is here, isn't a part of this movement. And so they said, how do we create a platform? And it's not an organization. The World Global Christian Forum is not an organization you can join. They have no members. Because the methodology is about encounter. And preparing for this course, I had the course read a small excerpt about a Methodist observer at Vatican II, and he talked about the natural consequence was initiation, cooperation, and negotiation for the ecumenical movement. Now, all those words are problematic, but what he pointed to is that this was the initiation. It was the encounter. It was us coming together. It was us realizing in Vatican II that we were separated brethren, which is the language of Vatican II, that we were siblings in Christ, but separated. So how do we continue to expand that? And the Global Christian Forum was the answer to that. And so the Global Christian Forum has 4 pillars of what's the constituents, I think is the word they use. Members of the World Council of Churches, the Roman Catholic Church, the Pentecostal World Fellowship, and the World Evangelical Alliance. And they don't do dialogue. I mean, it's very, their methodology is primarily of bringing people from all of those strands of Christianity together to encounter and to help us realize that we're siblings in Christ. And then let other movements try to pick that up and harness that to deepen those relationships and continue the pilgrimage.
Well, I think I'd like to move in a way to a little bit more concrete questions. Thinking about your work at the Vatican, sort of, these are, I guess you could say these maybe they're more human questions. What about your work during the time that you've been there has surprised you the most? I'm thinking about this in sort of 2 directions. But what about your job has surprised you? What have you found yourself doing or being involved in that you didn't anticipate? But then also, what is it about the Roman Catholic Church that you've learned in this process that surprised you or you've learned from the most?
One of the surprises, I was deeply saddened at the death of Pope Francis. I'm a Methodist. I have never felt more Methodist than the 5 years I've worked in Rome. I mean, really, whatever impression I had before then was really changed. And I don't say that to be kind of sectarian in that sense, but I have never felt more Methodist. And so when Pope Francis died, he's not my church leader. An important figure in the church I was working with, but not my church leader. And I had the opportunity to go to Casa Santa Marta. This is the hotel in the Vatican where he lived. To the chapel where he was. People connected with the Vatican could see him before he was officially laid in state. And I remember going. It was late at night, 11 o'clock at night, and it was very quiet. And there were some people in the chapel, and just being moved about the life and witness of this person who was not my church leader, but obviously is important in my story, and my experience, and my story of the Christian faith, and being thankful for his life and witness, particularly when it came to questions of Christian unity. So that's one thing that surprised me. I've also learned that the Catholic Church is 1.4 billion people, and in spite of what they may say, they're quite a diverse group of 1.4 billion Christians, and so there is also an emerging frontier for them to reclaim some of that diversity, and it's surprising because I often thought of Rome as being this place where everything was about homogenizing, making uniform, and there's certainly that element. And then they're also coming back now after some work that started in the pontificate of Pope Francis around synodality, which, if you want to talk about, it's a very long kind of story, but what does it mean to be a listening and discerning church? And that's about seeing the people who are there. It's about seeing the God-given gifts of diversity. It's about discerning what does unity mean in the midst of diversity. And I find that as a Methodist we often want to celebrate our diversity to be an interesting and encouraging sign.
Maybe you could say a word more about synodality. I mean, that was certainly impressive to us in our brief time there, that we were kind of in the midst of the two meetings of the synod, and if not to be Protestant triumphalist in any way about this, but you could see the synodality movement in Roman Catholicism as part of their enrichment by the ecumenical movement. Certainly it comes from sources within their own tradition, but that Pope Francis should have this idea that we should have a kind of quasi governmental process. That means the bishops are the authoritative people in the Roman Catholic Church, but now they're meeting together, side with the lay people, and with women, and with representatives of other other Christian groups. So I know synodality is a long story, but can you give the short version of this?
So a synod is a meeting, right? So in some of our churches we call them synods, others we don't. But it's a gathering of the people of God, to try to use some of the Catholic language. And synods then became the place where discernment and decision-making would be taken. In the 1960s, during the Second Vatican Council, which is this time where there are major reforms in the Catholic Church, they decided, wouldn't it be great if we had a mechanism to have more frequent encounter? So 1960s is the Second Vatican Council. The First Vatican Council happens, does anybody know? 1869, 1870. So they said, that's been a long time since we had a group of people discerning. And so this idea of the Synod of Bishops emerges, and it really put the responsibility on bishops in the Catholic Church. They're the ones who discern and listen and decide. Pope Francis said, wait a minute, what do we believe about baptism? That in baptism, we're all made part of the body of Christ. We become part of the priesthood of all believers. They would use it in a slightly different way than maybe as a Protestant, but and that as the people of God, that we all have a responsibility for listening and discerning. And so it's an initiative that's maybe not well understood or talked about, but an important initiative of Pope Francis to say the Catholic Church will not only rely on bishops listening, and it's not only bishops listening to people in their dioceses, that to really discern the will of God, that Catholics need to go talk to other Christians, they need to go talk to other people of other religions, they need to go talk to people who are not a part of any religious tradition, that it's really part of, in some ways, what we would talk about as a mission imperative now about going from the center to the margins, where God's already at work. Go, you want to hear discernment, go talk to people who are on the margins. That's where Christ is already. Let's hear what God's inviting us to do. So it's to help reframe that discernment and decision-making to be a more missional Catholic Church. And so that then culminated in 2 4-week plenary sessions where the bishops who are part of the synod, which are about 300, were joined by priests and lay people, and among the lay people, half were women. So, and they all had equal status. They all voted. They all had the same voice. Didn't matter whether you had bishop in front of your name or not, which is radical. And for my church, you think we've been doing this for a while. For them, it's a fundamental shift in how they're thinking about these questions. And part of that is, I would say, point to the fruit of how we journey together as churches, because in this process, our office was speaking into the preparation of it. They came and said, how do Methodists do synodality? The word we would use is conferencing or conferring. How do you make decisions? How do you discern? What does that mean? How do you have lay people who may not have a lot of theological training? How can they listen to God? I mean, do they, what are the rules? What are the rules you do for the, so that was speaking into the immediate process, but certainly it was a culmination of a larger, I think, accompaniment with other churches, both Easterns, the Orthodox churches, and the Protestants, who have strong traditions of synodality.
And we can certainly think about ways in which churches, including your own, there's been a reciprocal kind of learning from this process. I want to go back to you said earlier that when you were in college, you thought about diplomatic service and international relations and so on. You kind of ended up in this in the end anyway. I mean, the Vatican is a state.
Yes.
It's other countries have ambassadors there. It's an international relations. So can you say a little bit about what that's like? I mean, you're not representing a country, but you're in there kind of rubbing shoulders with people who are representing countries and doing international political sort of things.
Right. So the Vatican is the headquarters of a church, and under international law, it is a country. So it is a sovereign state. The Pope is also a king. He is the only legislator of the country of which he is the king of, and he is the supreme judge. Other countries, we would call this a dictator, but we don't say that there. They actually have much more developed systems than simply saying that. They have a court system and other discernment processes. And the United States, since 1984, has recognized the Vatican as a sovereign state. It creates, at times, competing interests for the Vatican. So let's take Ukraine as an example, and the war of Russian aggression in Ukraine. The Vatican has historically tried to play in international conflicts in the 20th and 21st century a peace-making, peace-brokering role. For that to happen, you probably shouldn't criticize the governments involved in the war. Our government here in the US and other governments in Europe and some in Asia had very, very clear things to say about what Russia was doing in Ukraine. And they were banging on the doors of the Secretariat of State. This is the department in the Vatican. Part of it is the government functioning part of the Vatican, saying the Pope must come out and condemn this war. Their position is, if the Pope condemns the war, does that jeopardize them playing a role, a peacemaking brokering role? And that's been important for them because they've seen in conflict where sides can become entrenched, and somehow the Vatican can play publicly or privately an important role. And then Catholics were saying, isn't there Catholic social teaching on war? And this was an act of aggression which Catholic social teaching would speak against, and the right of Ukrainians to defend themselves against aggression. And so nobody was happy with what the Vatican was doing at that time, 3 years ago. And some are not happy with that position because they in some ways have competing kind of competing interests in what they're wanting to say and to do. Because like I would understand the church being prophetic, right? That would be, so in that case, prophetic would mean speaking out against it. And there were some who were doing that and wanting the Vatican to do that, and there were other interests as well. I'm trying to think of some other recent examples where certainly our work, there are 80 million Methodists worldwide. That's more than a lot of countries in the world. So we work very closely with the diplomatic community, with ambassadors. Part of the representational work is networking with ambassadors and diplomatic missions, with embassies. And it's really helpful for us as Methodists to do that in that space, because everybody has an embassy to this government that's also really a church headquarters. And it makes countries where them interacting with religious leaders actually easier. So it's in some ways conflicting for the U.S. government to have an embassy to the Vatican because it does not want to be engaged in religious activity. And yet I know I can, if there's issues, I've had church leaders or other issues that are important that we as a Methodist family worldwide want to speak into that deal with the U.S., I know I can call them and say, I want to come and speak to you about these issues. And I know at least one person from the U.S. government will receive me and listen. Because I know a senior representative, because the ambassador will, or other countries. Likewise, other missions have seen it important for them to engage in some of their important work ecumenically, so with other Christians. So we did work with the British and Irish embassies around peacemaking in Northern Ireland. And if they'd only dealt with Catholics, that only feeds into long-standing suspicion. They said, oh, this could be an interesting platform, and we want to celebrate what religious leaders continue to do in a place where the legacy of the troubles and the violence persist. And we know we have to do that with Anglicans and Methodists and Presbyterians, because those are the four main churches in Northern Ireland. Oh, Matthew, you're here. Oh, you're a Methodist, right? Can you help? Can you help us with the other colleagues? Can you help us create an opportunity to engage in that way?
Well, that leads me to another area quite naturally, I think, which is when the Vatican, after Vatican II, decided to be engaged in ecumenical conversation, it sent a lot of Protestants scurrying because they said, well, Rome wants to talk to us. We should think about what we ought to say. And also started Protestants talking to each other in a slightly different way about, not entirely, let's get our story straight, but conferring with each other. So Melissa and I were very impressed when we were in Rome to see how much being in Rome to relate to the Roman Catholic churches becomes an occasion of the churches relating to each other. I'm thinking now of Protestant churches primarily and so on, and that seems to be a part of your work also, which is, now you just touched on that, it's an occasion. We're here and we can find a way to work together, but there's part of what you're doing that doesn't even necessarily directly relate to the Roman Catholic Church. It relates to others.
Right, yeah. Because other churches have a permanent presence doing this representational work. Anglicans, the Reformed Presbyterians, some of the Orthodox churches. And you're absolutely right. One of the natural issues is we're all very small. We don't have enough resources, both human and financial. So in a very practical way, we go to the others and say, we want to do this, can you help us? You know, literally, very small, not programmatic whatsoever, but we had, for the funeral of Pope Francis, all of our churches had church leaders coming, we had delegations. We had to feed them, right? We had to get them around, you know, we said, well, let's feed them together, you know. So the Methodists and Lutherans and Anglicans and Presbyterians said, oh, let's, you know, feed them together. Oh, but, you know, that means I'm serving the breadstick and you're serving the wine and you're, you know, like this is, but I can talk about it in a very utilitarian, practical way, but it actually comes out of deep, deep relationships our churches already have at that international level. So our communions already, the Anglican Communion, the World Methodist Council, the World Communion Reformed churches are already working very closely in so many other areas. Of course, we're going to be trying not only to be personally supportive of one another, but think about the issues that we have that are bilateral. So they're about us and about the Methodist and Catholic. But actually want to talk to the Anglicans about that too. What are you thinking about, and how can we share in that? And then sharing about how we're thinking and working with Catholics, it actually deepens our relationship with one another, because it becomes an opportunity for dialogue, for accompaniment, for relationships that can sustain that growth together.
So you've touched on this already, but I wanted to ask you how this work has changed your perspective on Methodism. You said, well, it's made you feel more Methodist than ever, and so on. So that's certainly one answer to the question. But are there specific ways in which it's sort of affected your understanding of your own tradition, or being in dialogue in this way has reshaped some of your own perspective?
Mm-hmm. So the first thing that comes to mind for me this year, we heard it in chapel, for those of you who are at chapel, this year, 1,700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. I hope you read something about it, and it's really trying to be an opportunity to celebrate unity. Nicaea was complicated and was not only a moment of unity, but disunity as well. And we've talked a lot, what does it mean to be one holy Catholic and apostolic? That comes from that creed, one holy Catholic and apostolic. And I've had more than one people in Rome tell me that I'm from a new church. What do you mean, a new church? And they say, well, right, who's the founder of your church? Jesus Christ, right? Well, I thought it was some guy named Wesley. Oh, I mean, yeah, okay, but it's to point to part of what's helped me reclaim, or what I hope Methodists will try to reclaim in this Nicaea year, is a sense of apostolicity, which is a nice way of saying that for Methodists, that it's not only about what happened in the 1700s in a particular place, that it's about a continuity of the ministry of the apostles themselves. And I think that's important because it changes the conversation with our Catholic siblings, because they feel like they have apostolicity. So when we talk about one holy Catholic and apostolic, part of our work is figuring out that we're holy, that we're apostolic, that we're one, that we're Catholic together. And so it's trying to reframe that actually Methodists can take pride in that we're a church of the apostles. You can see that in our teaching. It's not the historic reality, maybe, that Methodists don't emerge until much later, but that our teaching is that, and trying to encourage Methodists to reflect on that. So that would be one thing.
I think one thing, it's hard to be in Rome without some sense of Catholic small c, that is to say the 1 point whatever billion and the global scope and the historical breadth of this tradition. So I'm wondering whether it's your time there in this work has given you a different perspective on American churches generally, not just Methodist now. I'm thinking about, because it's brought you into contact with certainly the full breadth of Roman Catholic global constituents, which are all present in different ways in Rome itself. And then also your work in Moscow and your work in Vienna, you have that sort of perspective now a bit from a different place.
I will say, I haven't lived in this country in 15 years, or nearly 15 years. When I come back, it sometimes feels very foreign. So I think I would start with that. Sometimes I really understand American churches, and then other times I really scratch my head. And then I meet these Americans who are Catholic in Rome, and I'm even more confused, I think, about what's going on. Part of what I would say is that thinking about unity in our churches is important. That when you look at the Catholic Church in the United States, you look at Catholic bishops, they're polarized at times, developed for some a fortress mentality, a kind of siege mentality, want to withdraw from certain parts of public life, relationships with other Christians, with other religions, and somehow be triumphalistic about that. Like, this is what God intended for us in the world. And I would say that's not only Catholics. We can start making a list of, I see that from Catholics because that's how I encounter them in Rome. So that's your question. So I don't want to sound like it's only Catholics in this country. We see that in other places. And yet what we saw Pope Francis and Pope Leo talking about is a radical re-engagement of the church, and to be quite present in the lives of people in ways that maybe we've shied away from in more recent times, because it's made us uncomfortable, or we have to interact with people who don't think like us or act like us. And so that would be one thing I could see from Rome in the American church, kind of from a perspective in Rome.
Well, in a moment, I'm going to invite you to have an opportunity to ask questions you might be interested in asking about. So the final one I'll put to you is a very much kind of Vatican watching, American special interest. There's an American Pope. And so what, from up close watching that process, what does this mean? That this College of Cardinals picked this person at this time, and what's the feeling on the ground in Rome about things these days in the current papacy?
Well, I mean, certainly Robert Prevost was well respected by his colleagues. That's clear. You don't become Pope if everybody hates you. It's clear from the cardinals who would speak to me about, not about the process that they have committed not to share, but the discernment and kind of their own. And these are the ones who are working in the Vatican departments that we often relate to. He's well respected. I mean, there's a sense of they thought it was a good decision. That's why they elected him, and that was because he was already well respected. It wasn't as if they came into the room and said, "Well, who can we find that guy back there, what's your name again? I mean, he was, even though he'd only been back in Rome for a couple of years, he already had an outstanding reputation and somehow was a leader that they would want to choose. Part of that, it's clear Pope Leo is continuing some of the major initiatives of Pope Francis. So they were not electing somebody to correct course fundamentally of Pope Francis. So sometimes you see, okay, well, maybe Pope Benedict went a little bit too far, so we want to elect Pope Francis to bring us to a different space. Certainly, Pope Leo will be his own person, and he, you can already see in some small things, has taken a different approach. I'm not sure that they've fundamentally diverged from Pope Francis yet, what we saw as pontificate. But I think he's interested in trying to bring back into better standing some of the elements of the Catholic Church that were more, that felt disenfranchised under Pope Francis. He's taken a very kind of different approach to them. But we've already seen Pope Leo talk a lot about peace. So he's talked a lot about peace in ways that Pope Francis hadn't. So I think part of that will mark his pontificate. And, you know, he's 69, which in my church means as a bishop you need to be retiring. In the Catholic Church, that means we're going to elect you as the head of the church. And, you know, if he lives as long as Pope Francis, we have nearly 20 years. So they were thinking about somebody who wasn't only kind of caretaker pope. Because sometimes they've elected that too. People who, okay, we know they're going to die soon, and we only want somebody for 2 or 3 years because we got to figure something else out. John the 23rd was one of those. John the 23rd lived longer than they expected, and he's the one who convened the Second Vatican Council. So he did quite radical things. I'm not sure Pope Leo will be as radical, but certainly they want somebody for stability as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your patience. But those who might like to ask a question, please signify. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm from Vienna, so it's really, really nice to hear that you had a good time there. My question is, I don't know if you remember, but at YDS we read a lot. And so I would really, really like to know theologians maybe that you admire that talk about this, like unity of Christians and like that being God's will for the church, but also maybe theologians not from your tradition that you feel have impacted your ministry and even as a disciple.
Good question. I think a lot of my work right now is dealing with official documents. So some of the places that I would encourage you to look are what have churches already said, or what's the World Council of Churches said, for example, on questions of unity. What does Christian unity mean? Because they've published a number of important texts that bring perspectives from theologians and from churches together in compilations and other resources that are fundamental to that, as well as documents from like from Vatican II. I would need to think on your question, but those are what are coming out of some of these bilateral dialogues and out of the World Council of Churches are things where there's a sense of consensus. So places that we as churches feel like we're being called to.
Yes, please.
I've noticed times when ecumenical disagreements or interreligious disagreements are situations of giving different answers to a question, and then there are other times when it's simply asking different questions. And I wonder if you've sort of seen examples of times when one of those was harder than the other in a way that was unexpected, that you ran into more problems with different answers or more problems with different questions, or I don't know if that generates anything.
So part of our work in dialogue, ecumenical dialogue is about dialogue among Christians. And Methodists and Catholics are Christians. I say that there are places in the world where Methodists would say Catholics are not Christians, and where Catholics would say we're the real Christians and not the Methodists. So I'm trying to think of an example from our dialogue where we would work on some of those questions, because it would not be uncommon that sometimes we use the same words and we realize we mean different things. I'm trying to think of a good example. Right now, what does diversity mean? So we've been spending 4 years talking about diversity. What Methodists mean by diversity is not the same thing Catholics mean. Because for Methodists, we would have a sense of diversity among our member churches. So we're 80 churches together. The importance of ecclesial autonomy. So every member church, every denomination, has autonomy from another Methodist church. So they're free to make their own decisions. Catholics say, absolutely not. That's not diversity. That's like chaos. That's anarchy. And we would say to them, but the system you have is about creating not unity, but uniformity that minimizes the diversity that's given from God. So that's created a lot of opportunity for us to explore what is diversity, what is the acceptable limits of diversity. At the same time, you also have to talk about unity. So Catholics can very easily talk about unity, the importance of the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, the Petrine ministry, the magisterium, the official teaching of the church, and the relationships that come from that. And Methodists are a bit harder pressed because we think our diversity is great, but what do we hold together as churches that bring us together as Methodists? And we've had to do more work. So they've had to do more work on diversity. We've had to do more work on unity to try to flesh that out. Does that answer your question?
So ecumenism really, you seem to meditate a lot on the fact that there have been these historical divisions. We are divided as Christians. So I'm wondering how you personally experienced the division that we just experienced in the Methodist Church, the United Methodist Church.
So schism.
Schism, yes. We just
Maybe slightly more specific about what how do I experience schism from?
When you watch
or disunity.
The United Methodist Church split, given all the thought that you put into unity and diversity and the divisions that have existed in the church historically, how did you personally experience that, watching this church split?
So, I have complicated feelings. Part of that is as a gay man. Part of that is around being somebody who's kind of on the inside. So I was part of decision making in the life of our church. And my life is about dialogue, deepening of relationships that lead us to unity. I've been really conflicted. And not always sure what I'm conflicted about, because at times it has felt like what's important to me as a person and who I am and the life that I feel God has called me to live as a baptized person was also at odds with what was happening in the United Methodist Church. So the United Methodist Church made some decisions, to give a brief synopsis for those who are here, that led to about 25% of the United Methodist Church in the United States separating itself from the United Methodist Church. Many of those churches formed another denomination. Some of them became independent congregations. And for those who left, it was purportedly around human sexuality, same-sex marriage blessings, and ordaining of openly queer clergy. It felt very antithetical as somebody who works for Christian Unity to also say, yeah, bye guys. As a gay man, I thought, oh wow, my church will now, in its church law, say something different, and I don't need to hide anymore. I don't need to protect myself anymore. And so I've lived with that, and I think at times I've probably skewed much more to the unity, to be honest with you. Not because I don't, as a gay man, don't want to be able to be open and not feel like I will be brought up on charges or defrocked. Those voices were already there in our church. There were very few voices talking about unity. And so I also felt like I needed to have some integrity to that as well. And so living in that, but often I think skewing to say, we have to have better dialogue. We have to find ways of achieving unity.
I think we'll have to call an end to the time now. Thank you so much for those who attended, who are not part of the class, as well as those who are part of the class. They just had a little bit less choice about being here. So we want to thank Matthew for sharing with us as well as he did.